My name is Colonel Samuel Ghost Richardson, retired. And if you've never been called a fraud by someone young enough to be your grandson, consider yourself fortunate, especially when that someone wears a black robe and has the power to destroy your life with a single ruling. It started with a routine disability benefits review hearing. Nothing unusual. The VA periodically reassesses veterans to make sure they're still eligible for the compensation they receive. I'd been through it before. Always a formality. My service-connected disabilities were well documented. Tinnitus from artillery fire, chronic back pain from a helicopter crash, and what the doctors politely called adjustment disorder, but everyone else knew as PTSD. What I didn't expect was Judge Robert Morrison. Morrison was new to the federal bench, appointed just 6 months earlier. 38 years old, Harvard Law Review, son of a pharmaceutical company CEO. The kind of guy who'd never missed a meal, never slept in a foxhole, never had to make life or death decisions before his morning coffee. The kind who viewed military service as something other people did to pay for college. The hearing was supposed to be straightforward. My lawyer, Janet Stevens, had prepared all the documentation, medical records, service records, statements from fellow veterans. It should have taken 30 minutes, max. But Morrison had other ideas. "Mr. Richardson," he began, deliberately omitting my rank, a small slight that every veteran in the room noticed. "I've reviewed your file, and I have some concerns." "What kind of concerns, Your Honor?" Janet asked. Morrison leaned back in his chair with the smugness of someone who believed his Ivy League education made him superior to everyone else in the room. The kind of concerns that arise when someone claims 30 years of military service but has documentation that reads like a Hollywood script. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept quiet. 30 years in the military teaches you when to speak and when to listen. This was a listening moment. "Your Honor," Janet said carefully, "Colonel Richardson's service record has been verified by the Department of Defense. His awards and commendations are legitimate." "Are they?" Morrison picked up a folder from his desk. "Let's see. Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. And according to this, he served in Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. That's quite a career for someone who's only 72 years old. Colonel Richardson enlisted at 17, Your Honor. His service span, save it, counselor." Morrison's voice dripped with disdain. "I've seen enough manufactured war heroes in my courtroom to spot the pattern. Convenient records, impressive medals, and always just classified enough that nobody can verify the details." The room went dead silent. I could feel the other veterans in the gallery shifting uncomfortably behind me. My hands, which had been steady under enemy fire for 3 decades, started to shake slightly. "Your Honor," Janet's voice was strained, "I must object to the characterization of my client as what? A fraud." Morrison smiled coldly. "Because that's exactly what I think we're dealing with here. Another aging man who's decided that taxpayers should fund his retirement based on convenient fiction." That's when I stood up. "Sit down, Mr. Richardson," Morrison snapped. "That's Colonel Richardson," I said quietly. "Not in my courtroom, it isn't. In my courtroom, you're just another citizen trying to game the system." The words hit like a physical blow. 30 years of service reduced to gaming the system by someone who'd never worn a uniform, never been shot at, never held a dying soldier in his arms. "Your Honor," Janet tried again, "perhaps we could review the specific documentation." "I've seen the documentation. Classified this, classified that." Convenient how the most impressive parts of his record are always the parts we can't verify, isn't it? Morrison was enjoying this. I could see it in his eyes, the way he leaned forward when he spoke, the slight smirk when he thought he'd scored a point. This wasn't about justice or proper procedure. This was about a privileged kid showing off his power over someone he considered beneath him. "Let me tell you what I see," Morrison continued, warming to his theme. "I see a man who probably did serve in the military. A lot of people did. But somewhere along the way he decided that his actual service wasn't impressive enough. So he embellished. Added some medals here, some classified operations there. Made himself into the war hero he always wanted to be. I felt 30 years of discipline holding me in place. Everything in my training said to stay calm, follow procedure, respect the chain of command. But Judge Morrison wasn't in my chain of command. He was just another civilian who thought his ignorance was equivalent to wisdom. The problem, Morrison said, clearly enjoying his monologue, is that veterans like Mr. Richardson are bleeding honest taxpayers dry. They come into my courtroom with their manufactured sob stories and their convenient disabilities, expecting us to pay for their inability to adapt to civilian life. Janet was frantically taking notes, probably preparing for appeal, but I could see in her eyes that she was as stunned as I was. Neither of us had expected this level of hostility. Your Honor, she said, even if the court has questions about specific aspects of Colonel Richardson's record, his current disabilities are well documented by VA physicians. The medical evidence shows exactly what you'd expect to see from someone trying to milk the system. Morrison interrupted. Back pain, impossible to verify. Tinnitus, convenient and unprovable. PTSD, the catch-all excuse for anyone who wants a government handout. That last one crossed a line. PTSD wasn't an excuse, it was a wound. An invisible wound that had cost more veterans their lives than enemy bullets ever had. And this pompous child was dismissing it like it was a scam. Your Honor, I said, my voice carefully controlled. With respect, you don't know what you're talking about. Morrison's eyes flashed. Excuse me, PTSD isn't an excuse. It's not a scam. It's what happens when you send 19-year-old kids into combat, and they see things that would break most adults. Sit down, Mr. Richardson. I've buried more good soldiers than you've probably met in your entire life. Kids who came home broken and never got the help they needed because people like you told them they were weak, or lying, or gaming the system. Mr. Richardson, I'm warning you, you want to know about gaming the system. How about trust fund kids who get federal judgeships because daddy donated to the right political campaigns? The gavel came down like a gunshot. That's enough, Mr. Richardson. You are in contempt of this court. I was on dangerous ground now, but I was past caring. This spoiled brat had just insulted every veteran who'd ever struggled with the wounds of war, and I wasn't going to let it slide. Your Honor, Janet said desperately, my client is clearly upset by the characterization of his service. Perhaps we could take a recess. There will be no recess. Mr. Richardson, you will sit down and show proper respect for this court, or I will have you removed in handcuffs. I looked at Morrison, really looked at him. Soft hands that had never held a weapon. Pale skin that had never seen a desert sun. Eyes that had never seen the aftermath of an IED explosion. This was the person judging my life, my service, my worth. You know what, Your Honor, I said, sitting back down. You're right. I should show proper respect. The same respect you've shown me, and every other veteran who's sacrificed for this country. Morrison's face was turning red. Mr. Richardson, I find you in contempt of court. You will be fined $5,000, and that's when his clerk rushed in with a phone. Your Honor, she whispered urgently. There's a call for you. They say it's urgent. I'm in the middle of a hearing. Sir, they said it's about Mr. Richardson. From the Pentagon. Morrison looked annoyed. Tell them to call back during recess. The clerk leaned in closer. Your Honor, the caller identified himself as the Secretary of Defense. The color drained from Morrison's face. He looked at the phone like it might explode, then at me with something approaching uncertainty for the first time all morning. I'll take it in chambers, he said. Sir, he insisted on speaking with you immediately. About the Richardson matter. Morrison's hand shook slightly as he took the phone. The courtroom was dead silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. This is Judge Morrison, he said into the phone. We couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but we could see Morrison's face changing by the second. The arrogance melted away, replaced by confusion, then shock, then what looked like genuine fear. Yes, sir, he said quietly. Yes, I understand. But surely you can appreciate that in this courtroom I have to. Another pause. Morrison's face went white. No, sir. No, sir. I didn't realize. I mean, the documentation didn't indicate. He glanced at me, and for the first time, there was no smugness in his eyes. Just worry. Yes, sir. Of course. Right away. Morrison hung up the phone and stared at it for a long moment. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear individual heartbeats. Mr. Richardson, he said finally, his voice completely different from before, smaller, uncertain. Yes, Your Honor. It appears there may have been some confusion about your service record. Janet leaned forward. What kind of confusion, Your Honor? Morrison looked at the papers on his desk like they were written in a foreign language. The Secretary of Defense has just informed me that portions of Mr. Richardson's file are classified at levels that require special clearance to access. What does that mean? Janet asked. Morrison swallowed hard. It means that the service record I was reviewing contains only the unclassified portions of Mr. Richardson's military career. The complete record is considerably more extensive. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was smiling. Someone at the Pentagon had just schooled a federal judge on the concept of security clearances. Your Honor, Janet said carefully, does this change the court's assessment of my client's benefits claim? Morrison looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. The Secretary of Defense has requested that this matter be transferred to a military tribunal for proper review. Apparently, questioning the legitimacy of Mr. Richardson's service record raises certain national security considerations. The irony was beautiful. Morrison had been so eager to expose what he thought was fraud that he'd stumbled into information that was actually protected by federal law. And now he was being told by people with real authority that he was out of his depth. Furthermore, Morrison continued, reading from notes he'd scribbled during the phone call, I am informed that Mr. Richardson's actual rank and service history are classified above my clearance level, and that any public discussion of certain aspects of his military career would violate the Espionage Act. Janet was trying hard not to smile. So the court withdraws its allegations of fraud? Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. The court acknowledges that it may have operated under incomplete information. May have, I asked quietly. Morrison's jaw tightened, but his voice remained subdued. The court acknowledges that it operated under incomplete information and withdraws any suggestion that Mr. Richardson's service record is anything other than legitimate. And the contempt citation, another long pause. Withdrawn. The gallery behind me erupted in quiet murmurs. Other veterans had been watching this proceedings, and they'd just seen something that rarely happened, a federal judge being forced to back down. Your Honor, Janet said, given this new information, I assume my client's benefits will be approved? Morrison looked at his papers, then at me, then back at his papers. Mr. Richardson's benefits are approved pending the military tribunal review. In the meantime, all payments will continue without interruption. It was over. Not just the hearing, but Morrison's little power trip. He'd tried to humiliate a veteran in front of a courtroom full of people, and instead had been humiliated himself by someone with actual authority. As we packed up our papers, Morrison called out one last time, Mr. Richardson. I turned back to face him. I want to apologize for any misunderstanding about your service. I studied his face. The apology was genuine, but it was also self-preservation. He knew that word of this hearing would get around, and he didn't want to be known as the judge who attacked a decorated veteran. Your Honor, I said quietly, the misunderstanding wasn't about my service. It was about your assumption that you could judge something you've never experienced. Morrison nodded slowly. Point taken. As we walked out of the courtroom, Janet was practically bouncing with excitement. Sam, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like that. A federal judge getting called by the Secretary of Defense? What the hell is in your file? I smiled. Classified information. Come on, you can tell me something. What did you really do in the military? I told you. Classified. But as we walked through the courthouse lobby, I reflected on what had just happened. It wasn't really about my classified service record, though that had certainly gotten Morrison's attention. It was about respect, about understanding that some things are bigger than your personal prejudices and assumptions. Morrison had looked at me and seen what he expected to see, an old man trying to game the system. He'd never considered that there might be more to the story, that the calm exterior might hide experiences he couldn't imagine. The truth was, most of my service record really was classified, not because it was particularly dramatic or Hollywood-worthy, but because military intelligence work tends to involve a lot of boring, important details that can't be made public for decades. But Morrison didn't know that. All he knew was that he'd just been told by the highest levels of the Defense Department that he was messing with something above his pay grade. Outside the courthouse, a small group of veterans who'd been watching the proceedings came up to congratulate me. Colonel, said an older man with a Vietnam veteran's cap. That was beautiful. That kid needed to be taken down a peg. He's just young, I said. Hopefully he learned something today. What did you do in the service? asked a younger veteran, probably Iraq or Afghanistan era. Intelligence work mostly. Nothing too exciting. They nodded respectfully. In the veteran community, intelligence work was code for don't ask for details. They understood. But as I drove home, I thought about what had really happened in that courtroom. It wasn't about my classified record or Morrison's comeuppance. It was about the assumptions we make about people based on appearances. Morrison had looked at a 72-year-old man asking for disability benefits and assumed he was seeing a fraud. He'd never considered that appearances can be deceiving, that the quiet old guy might have a background he couldn't imagine. The same thing happened to veterans every day. People saw the disabilities, the struggles with civilian life, the need for government assistance, and they made assumptions. They didn't see the 19-year-old who'd volunteered to serve his country, or the 25-year-old who'd made life or death decisions under fire, or the 40-year-old who'd sacrificed family time for deployments. They just saw someone they thought was gaming the system. A week later, Janet called with an update. "Sam, you're not going to believe this. The military tribunal reviewed your case and not only approved all your benefits, they increased them. Apparently there were some service-connected issues that hadn't been properly documented in your civilian file." Really? Really? And get this, Judge Morrison called me personally to apologize again. He wants to meet with you privately to discuss what happened. I thought about that. Why? He said he wants to understand what he got wrong. Apparently that phone call from the Pentagon really shook him up. "Set it up," I said. But not in his courtroom. 2 days later I met Morrison at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He looked different in civilian clothes, younger, less imposing. Without the black robe and elevated bench, he was just another guy struggling to understand something bigger than himself. "Colonel Richardson," he said as I sat down. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Just Sam is fine." He nodded. "I want to apologize again for what happened in my courtroom. I was wrong, not just about your record, but about my whole approach to veteran disability cases." "What changed your mind?" Morrison stirred his coffee nervously. "That phone call. The Secretary of Defense didn't just tell me your record was classified. He spent 20 minutes explaining why veterans like you deserve better treatment from the federal court system. And he made me realize that I'd been approaching these cases with a presumption of fraud instead of a presumption of service. He said that every veteran who walks into a federal courtroom has already proven they're willing to sacrifice for their country, and that should earn them the benefit of the doubt, not suspicion." I nodded. "That's a good lesson." "He also told me something else," Morrison continued. "He said that the veterans who struggle most with the system are often the ones who served in capacities that can't be fully documented. Special operations, intelligence work, classified missions. The people who did the most sensitive work often have the least impressive-looking paperwork." "That's true." Old Morrison looked directly at me. "He said you were one of those people." I didn't respond to that. Some things stayed classified for good reasons. "Can I ask you something?" Morrison said. "Sure. How do I do better? How do I approach these cases in a way that serves justice without disrespecting the people who served?" It was a good question. An honest question from someone who genuinely wanted to learn. "Listen more than you talk," I said. "Remember that the person in front of you volunteered to do something you've never done. And understand that some wounds don't show up on X-rays or blood tests, but they're real nonetheless." Morrison nodded. "I've been reading about PTSD since our hearing. I had no idea, most civilians don't. It's not your fault that you didn't understand, but it is your responsibility to learn." The Secretary of Defense suggested I visit a VA hospital, spend some time talking to veterans about their experiences. Good idea. Would you be willing to show me around? Help me understand what I should be looking for?" I studied his face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility. The man who'd called my service record convenient fiction was asking me to educate him about veteran issues. "Sure," I said, "but not as a judge and a veteran. As two people trying to understand each other." Morrison smiled. A real smile, not the smug smirk from the courtroom. I'd like that. Over the next few months, Morrison became something unexpected: an advocate for veteran rights in the federal court system. He visited VA hospitals, attended veteran support groups, and completely changed his approach to disability cases. He also became something else unexpected: a friend. We met regularly for coffee, discussing cases he was working on without violating confidentiality. Of course, veteran issues in general, and sometimes just life. He was still young, still privileged, but he was also genuinely committed to learning from his mistakes. 6 months after our courtroom confrontation, Morrison was giving a speech to a federal judges' conference about veteran issues in the court system. He called me beforehand to ask if I'd attend. "I want to tell them about what happened between us," he said. "About how a phone call from the Pentagon taught me more about justice than 4 years of law school. You sure you want to admit to a room full of judges that you got schooled by a veteran?" Morrison laughed. "Actually, I want to tell them that the best education I ever got was from a veteran who had every right to hate me, but chose to teach me instead." The speech was good. Morrison talked about assumptions, about the difference between skepticism and cynicism, about the responsibility federal judges have to understand the communities they serve. He talked about me without using my name, referring to a veteran who taught me that classification levels exist for good reasons, and that the most impressive service often leaves the smallest paper trail. After the speech, several judges approached Morrison with questions about how to better handle veteran cases. The conversation he'd started was spreading to other courtrooms, other judges who might otherwise have made the same mistakes he had. As we drove home, Morrison was quiet for a while. "You know what the ironic thing is?" he said finally. "What's that?" "I still don't know what you really did in the military. After all this time, all these conversations, your actual service record is still classified." I smiled. "Does it matter?" Morrison thought about that. "No, I guess it doesn't. What matters is that you served, that you were willing to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. The details are just details. Now you're getting it. But I have to ask, was any of it like the movies? The classified stuff?" I looked out the window at the familiar landscape rolling by. Most of it was boring. Paperwork, meetings, reports. But some of it, I paused. Some of it was exactly like the movies. And some of it was worse than anything Hollywood could imagine. Morrison nodded. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being patient with an ignorant kid who thought his law degree made him smarter than everyone else. We all make mistakes. The difference is whether we learn from them." As Morrison dropped me off at home, I reflected on how strange life could be. 6 months ago, this man had called me a fraud in open court. Tonight he was one of my closest friends. The phone call from the Pentagon had forced him to reassess his assumptions, but everything that came after, the learning, the growth, the advocacy, that was his choice. That evening, my daughter called from California. "Dad, I saw something online about a federal judge giving a speech about veteran rights. The article mentioned that he'd had a case that changed his perspective. Was that you?" "Might have been." "What happened?" I gave her the short version. The hostile hearing, the phone call, the aftermath. "So this judge basically called you a liar in court, and now you're friends with him. People can change, honey. He made a mistake, but he owned up to it and learned from it. That's all you can ask for." I don't know if I could be that forgiving. It's not about forgiveness. It's about understanding that everyone's doing the best they can with the information they have. Morrison didn't know what he didn't know. Once he learned better, he did better. Still, calling your Purple Hearts fraudulent, he was wrong. But he was wrong out of ignorance, not malice. There's a difference. After I hung up, I sat in my study looking at the medals Morrison had questioned. The Purple Hearts, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross. They represented specific moments in time, specific choices made under fire. But they didn't tell the whole story. No medal could capture the full complexity of a military career. The boring parts and the classified parts, and the parts that simply couldn't be reduced to citations and commendations. Morrison had learned that lesson the hard way. He tried to judge a man's entire service based on an incomplete file, and discovered that reality was more complicated than his assumptions. The truth was, his initial instinct wasn't entirely wrong. There are people who exaggerate their military service, who claim benefits they haven't earned. But Morrison had made the mistake of assuming that anyone seeking benefits was probably one of those people. What the Pentagon phone call had taught him was that the system already had safeguards in place. Records were verified, claims were investigated, medical evidence was required. The vast majority of veterans seeking benefits had legitimately earned them through their service and sacrifice. And the ones with classified backgrounds, they often needed the most help, and had the hardest time proving their eligibility, because the very nature of their service made documentation complicated. A year later, Morrison was appointed to chair a federal task force on veteran issues in the court system. His first recommendation was mandatory training for all federal judges on military culture, veteran healthcare, and the unique challenges facing service members transitioning to civilian life. He called me the day the recommendation was approved. "Sam, we did it. Every federal judge in the country is going to get the education I should have had before I ever put on the robe." "That's great, Robert. Your dad would be proud." There was a pause. "You know, I never told you this, but I talked to my father about what happened between us." "Really? Really?" And he said something that surprised me. He said he'd always regretted not serving in Vietnam, that he'd gotten a deferment for college and then another for graduate school, and by the time he was done, the war was over. A lot of people made that choice. He said he'd spent his whole life wondering what he'd missed, and that maybe my hostility toward veterans came from inheriting his guilt about not serving. That was an interesting insight. Generational guilt manifesting as resentment toward the people who had done what their fathers couldn't or wouldn't do. "Maybe," I said. "But you've more than made up for it now." "I don't know about that. But I'm trying." As I write this, it's been 2 years since that first hearing. Morrison and I still meet for coffee monthly, still discuss cases and veteran issues and life in general. He's become one of the most veteran-friendly judges on the federal bench, and his task force recommendations have improved the treatment of veterans in courtrooms across the country. But the most important change isn't institutional, it's personal. Morrison learned to see veterans as individuals rather than as stereotypes. He learned that service takes many forms, that wounds aren't always visible, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is ask for help when you need it. And I learned something too, that people are capable of profound change when they're given the chance to learn from their mistakes. Morrison could have doubled down on his initial position, could have resented being corrected by the Pentagon. Instead, he chose to grow. That phone call from the Pentagon didn't just protect my benefits, it started a conversation that improved the lives of veterans across the country. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in courtrooms rather than combat zones, and sometimes the most important victories are measured in changed minds rather than captured territory. Judge Morrison called my service record convenient fiction, and my benefits theft from honest taxpayers. He was wrong about both, but more importantly, he was willing to admit he was wrong and do the work necessary to understand why. That takes a different kind of courage than what we needed in the military, but it's courage nonetheless. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. The courage to change, to learn, to become better than you were. Whether you're wearing a uniform or a black robe, that's a mission worth pursuing.